Right, welcome everybody. Love to see so many people here. We are absolutely delighted to have talking to us today Norman Baker, who is a former Lib Dem minister. He was also a member of the Privy Council, and he's written a book about the royal finances, the cover of which I put on the advert. So we are absolutely delighted to have him here today to talk about the actual scandal of the royal finances. But first of all, I'm going to go to Steve Freeman to introduce the meeting, and then we'll go to Norman.
Yes, thank you, Carol, and welcome to Norman. I just noticed as I was listening to the news that perhaps ex-Prince Harry, anyway, the Duke of Sussex, is visiting his dad. And we've had a right royal cock-up, as you know, because Harry's forgot to fill in or refused to fill in the forms that'll let him stay at Buckingham Palace. So, I mean, we don't get very far from a royal story, but just in a way for background for so that Norman can see where we're coming from. As the Republican Labour Education Forum, we were set up in 2022 to promote Republican democratic education with specific reference to Tony Benn's 1991-1992 Commonwealth Bill, a bill which he forward in the House of Commons, which the left, generally speaking, hasn't, I think, taken up or taken seriously. But it was a bill to establish a democratic and secular republic or commonwealth, as he called it. And one of the things we've emphasized is to draw a distinction between the crown and the monarch. And of course, originally, as Ben points out in his book, the crown and the king were the same thing when established by William the Conqueror when he was crowned in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. But there was later a separation. And so what we have tended to do in our education forum is talk a lot more about the crown as a very powerful corporate body, or like the state and the executive, rather than talk so much about the monarch or the king. And so we put our emphasis, as it were, on the constitution of the crown in Parliament and the idea of, in a sense, the crown as a corporate body. And separate from that, this separation, we have this thing we've called the Royal Family Limited, what the Duke of Edinburgh called the firm. So we haven't done much on the firm, or how it's financed or how it gets its revenue, but it's the other part of our story. And so it's really good, therefore, to have Norman here today to talk to us because he's going to really tell us about how the firm, the Royal Family Limited, or however you want to call it, is financed and how it gets its wealth. So we no more to do from me. The Royal Mint and the national debt. Norman, it's over to you. The shocking truth about the royal finances. And it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And welcome to everybody here. Thanks for coming along to join me tonight. I think the intention is I'll speak for about 20 minutes and then we have a discussion after that and you put questions or make your points following on from that. And I'll try to prove that if you ask a politician a straight question, you get a straight answer, or perhaps an ex-politician, it's easier to get a straight answer out of an ex-politician than out of a current politician. I want to say something, first of all, about the generality of royal finances, which is that they are indefensible. And when you raise these matters, when I raise these matters in discussions on TV and radio with monarchists, they always want to revert to the question as to whether we have a republic or whether we have a monarchy. They're more comfortable in that particular argument rather than trying to deal with the finances. I don't try to get into that except to point out that they say, do you want President Blair? And I say, well, nobody would elect President Blair. And if people did elect him, he could be got rid of at the next election, which is not an option for the monarch. And I just point out to them gently that if Charles had died before William and Harry were born, we would now have King Andrew I on the throne, which tends to, I think, undermine the hereditary principle rather severely. But let me talk about the royal finances and the book which I've written, which you have put on your cover somewhere. Royal Mint, national debt. You can tell a lot about a country that's got a royal mint and a national debt, I think is where the quote comes from. And there are two five-letter words which run through this book. One of them is money, and the other one is greed. Because the royal family, its present members, and indeed how it's been for decades, is steeped in greed. It's steeped in greed, fed by a sense of entitlement, fed by a sense of righteous appropriation of public funds, and the feeling that people should bow and scrape to them, and we should be jolly grateful that they exist at all. Now, if that seems rather 19th century or 18th century, it is. We had the last imperial monarchy in Europe. All the other monarchies have either been abolished or they've updated themselves to become servants of their country's constitution. And if you're looking at the elements of the crown, which you mentioned at the beginning there, Steve, you'll be aware, for example, the King of Norway had to take an oath of allegiance to the Parliament before he can take his seat. Whereas in this country, all of us have to take an oath of allegiance to the monarch, his or her heirs and successors before we can take our seats, no matter what platform we stood on at the election. And of course, his heirs and successors include Prince Andrew and Prince Harry, as things presently stand. But the central question in my book, which I posed, is how is it that a monarchy that was bankrupt effectively in 1760 has now become so fabulously and fantastically wealthy in 2026, 250 years later? Fantastically wealthy. The latest estimate for Charles is that he alone is worth 1.8 billion. That's an estimate made by The Guardian and by Channel 5. I think, if anything, it's an underestimate because it fails to take into account his overseas investments, which, of course, are hidden from us all. Although we did see a peek of what was happening when the Panama and Paradise Papers were leaked, and we saw the royals busy investing in dodgy offshore territories. When challenged, by the way, on this, they said that well, there was nothing suspicious. There was no advantage in doing so. In which case, the question is, why they didn't pop down to Barclays Bank on the corner and put all the money in there? To which there was no answer forthcoming. So, what are the methods that they've taken and the luxuries they've appointed to themselves, which have enabled them to secure this vast fortune? First of all, there's been generous amounts of money allocated from the public purse by Parliament, or now, in fact, without Parliament's assent, by the government of the day. And topically, if you just look at last week's announcement, the core grant, which is only one element of royal funding, but the core grant of the sovereign grant, the core element of that, doubled from 50 million to 100 million going forward. That's extraordinary and simply indefensible. And I look for any evidence of anyone else's salary being doubled in that period of time, unless it's perhaps the chairman of a water company who give themselves vast amounts of money to pollute our seas and our rivers. So public purse has been very generous. The civil list was a mechanism which was created in 1760, which enabled the royals to be given, well, the king to be given a sum of money to discharge his duties in return for the crown lands being handed over to Parliament, nowadays called the Crown Estate, which, contrary to the name and contrary to what Charles might like to insinuate, is a public body, and 100% of the money goes from the Crown Estate to the Treasury, and always has done since 1760. George Osborne, rather foolishly, acceded to pressure from Charles to reconnect, in one way, the Crown Estate's profits to the royal family, and we now have a calculation based on what the royal family gets, based on the profits of this property company called the Crown Estate. You may have to link the money to the royal family from the profits of Tesco's. It's as irrelevant as that. However, Charles hankers after the idea that the Crown Estates might return to the royal family one day, though he seems less keen on the other side of the argument, whereby the pre-1760 position enables the king, forces the king to fund the army, the navy, the civil service, customs and excise, and all the other matters which Parliament took under its wing in 1760. So the public purse has been very generous. And what we've seen is over-generous settlements, which no parliamentary party really, apart from possibly the Labour Party under Harold Wilson, has been willing to challenge. And the settlements for the royal family have always been very generous and always really above inflation over a long period of time. Back in Victorian times, Victoria and Albert in particular, argued that there wasn't enough money for the Queen to discharge her duties, notwithstanding she didn't do very much and was hidden away for quite some time. But the money was upped by Parliament out of embarrassment, and that money was used to buy, some of it was used to buy Sandringham and Balmoral. In other words, the amount of money given for one purpose was used for another. And I know from my time in Parliament, we have a definition of that. It's called fiddling your expenses. And that's what the Rolls did to achieve those particular buildings. So the amount of money coming from the public purse has been enormous. Secondly, there are the duchies of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster. The Duchy of Cornwall giving William a nice, healthy handout of about £22 million a year at the moment, and the Duchy of Lancaster giving the King about £28 million a year. Now, those duchies, they call them private, but they've existed since about the 14th, 15th century. And before 1800, there was a piece of legislation came in 1800. Before that day, the king was not allowed to own property personally. So it's a mystery, isn't it, how something which couldn't have been owned by the king before 1800 has suddenly become private property, because no act of parliament has been introduced to transfer from the crown to the monarch personally these duchies or the Prince of Wales. No, in fact, quite the reverse, because in Victorian times, an act of parliament was passed to regulate the duchies, to require them to produce annual reports, and the Duchy of Lancaster, even still, has a minister in the cabinet. And of course, they don't pay corporation tax or capital gains tax. So this is the most peculiar private estate. I don't believe it's a private estate. It should be wrapped up into the Crown estate, and that's £50 million a year that has become a royal slush fund that should be going to the Treasury to pay for public services. But that's been happening now in giving money to the royals for centuries, and that's one of the reasons why they got so much money completely wrongly, and they don't deserve that money. It's not their land. Thirdly, you've got the situation where there's been massive tax exemptions. Before 1952, in 1952, Winston Churchill decided that the new Queen needed a hand up to make sure she was in a safe position. So he made sure she paid no tax of any sort whatsoever from 1952, and that remained the position until 1993, when there was public revolt about the idea that the public should pay for the refurbishment of Windsor Castle after the fire. And only at that point did the Queen and Charles, then Prince of Wales, begin to pay tax voluntarily. But you imagine what 40 years exemption from tax, coupled with massive investments on which no tax was paid, had provided. The Daily Mail, that organ of the left, as you will recognise, calculated in about 2001 that the exemption from dividend income tax, which the Queen benefited from, probably gave her, that one exemption probably gave her close to £1 billion benefit from not having to pay tax over those 40 years, just that one thing, which suggests, by the way, that the 1.8 billion estimate for Charles is probably quite an underestimate. There's exemption, of course, from inheritance tax. Why should one of the richest families in the country be exempt from inheritance tax? I've not yet heard a reasonable defence of that position from anybody, not even a monarchist, because it's pretty indefensible. We're not talking here about the matters held by the king on behalf of the state. We're not talking about Buckingham Palace or the crown jewels and so on. I'm talking about the string of racehorses, the £100 million stamp collection, the Fabergé paintings, the Monet eggs, Monet paintings, Fabergé eggs, and of course also the £500 million of jewellery that's been accumulated over the decades, which was all handed over to Charles without any inheritance tax being paid. Why should he be exempt from that inheritance tax? It's thought that the Treasury lost 25 million when the Queen Mother died because no inheritance tax was paid on her estate either. Why should we give these people so much freedom to keep money that everybody else has to pay? So the exemption from tax has been a wonderful boon, of course, for the royal family. Then there are the gifts. If you are a member of Parliament or a member of the House of Lords, or indeed a councillor, you are required to log what you are given. And certainly I know as a minister, if you get something given to you worth more than, well, £50 in my day, you either have to buy it or you have to hand it over to a charity, or put it in the vault somewhere within the government service. And that's quite right, in order to avoid the suggestion of corruption. It might be relevant to certain matters going on today involving the Reform Party. But those rules are very clear to MPs and peers and government ministers. But there's no requirement for even a register of gifts to be kept by the royal family. There was an attempt in 2001 by Labour and Lib Dem and SNP MPs to bring that in. Didn't succeed, almost did actually, but didn't succeed. So the position at the moment is, if you receive a gift as a member of the royal family, you personally, that member who receives a gift, decide whether it's a matter given to you on behalf of the state or given to you in a personal capacity. Again, it sounds like what's happening with Nigel Farage at the moment. And unsurprisingly, of course, a great many gifts which really look like they were given to the country have been kept as personal gifts by members of the royal family. And those gifts given particularly from Middle Eastern states, are often worth a great deal of money. There is a guide now that says that if you are on an overseas visit, the assumption should be that anything given to you is given to the state. That hasn't stopped, for example, Camilla keeping jewels given to her on an overseas visit, when clearly they ought to have been handed over to the public through the government. That didn't happen. So there's been massive increase in that wealth from gifts, either from the failure to declare them properly and to hand over to the state what should have been handed over, or alternatively, bequests from star-struck monarchists over the years. The Guinness inheritance in 1942 gave the Queen Mother a windfall, fabulous windfall of jewels. The Castle of May was given to the Queen Mother by someone who actually just wanted to give it to her. She insisted on paying. She paid £100 for it, which seems like quite a good deal in those circumstances. So all of that has been given to the royal family by people who really ought to know better, and that's increased their wealth enormously. Then it's been all the dodgy investments overseas, which I referred to, which we saw a bit of when the lid was lifted on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. And how has all this managed to survive the decades without people in Parliament or anyone else querying it? Well, first of all, Parliament's been hobbled by the wording of Erskine May, the Parliamentary Bible, in 1844, which decided that, and wrote down, that MPs should not be criticising or questioning members of the royal family in a discourteous way. In other words, you can't really raise these questions properly. I was the only MP in 18 years in my time in Parliament to raise a debate on the royals and royal finances. And the only way I could do so to get past the hurdles put in front of me was to link my debate title back to an obscure Treasury paper from 10 years earlier. And that day we used to have a half-hour debate. That was the only debate that took place. But you're not supposed to criticise the royal family in the House. It's open season on Andrew now, the Speaker's declared, but Erskine May still applies almost 200 years on to other royal matters, although there's plenty of criticism from the public now happening. So that's one problem. Secondly, there's been a culture of deference. The culture of deference means that we've been prepared to bow and curtsy. I haven't, but bow and curtsy to the royal family and show them, inverted commas, respect, when really, in a modern democracy, that should be earned. Respect should be earned, not automatically given to someone who's unelected. But nevertheless, that culture of deference had existed. Back in 1952, when the Queen was coronated, the armed forces who were present at the coronation were told, out of respect, they were not allowed to engage in sexual activity for 48 hours before the coronation. Quite how that was enforced, I'm not quite sure. But that was the rule that was there. There was also a requirement that those girls or young women who held the train of the future Queen as she was being coronated had to be virgin daughters of members of the peerage. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. And it hasn't moved on a great deal since then. When one of the newspapers reported on an overseas visit by the Queen, and just for a bit of colour mentioned that she'd taken her shoes off to get comfortable, all hell broke loose in the palace. How dare you insult the Queen in this particular way? And of course, what the palace does now, which is much more effective in some ways, in the new age of people questioning matters is to make sure that the press who are compliant and publish nice stories get all the pictures of the young royals, who, by the way, when we're told we can't photograph because it's intruding in their private life, but they can release photographs of them, and they release nice photographs of them. And if you behave yourself as a media outlet, you can have the photographs. If you don't, then perhaps the photographs don't find their way to you. And when the interview with Diana took place, for example, in the 1990s, now discredited that interview when she talked about 3 people in her marriage. That was put up by the BBC, of course. And that year, the palace decided they would give the Christmas broadcast to ITV as punishment for doing something the royal family didn't agree with. These are the sort of tools they use. They also rely a great deal on secrecy. They are now effectively exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, although I was given an assurance by Rosie Winterton, who was a Labour minister at the time in about 2000, 2001, that they would not be exempt. They would be treated like any other bit of the public sector. And embarrassment, I asked this question specifically, and she confirmed embarrassment is not a reason not to release information. Well, that's all gone backwards at a rate of knots, largely because of Charles's spider letters, which the Guardian forced out, which revealed that Charles had been improperly lobbying ministers on political matters, such as wanting hunting to be maintained or wanting homeopathy to be given prominence in the NHS. It's not his role to do that as Prince of Wales. So when he was found out to have done that, he didn't come out and say, I'm sorry, I overstepped the mark. No, he went to the government and said, I want to carry on doing this, but I want to be protected by extensions to the Freedom of Information Act, exemptions, so that people don't find out in the future. And that's where we are now. A culture of secrecy, so it's difficult to find things out about the royals. And thirdly, of course, is the legal threats which they happily use against anyone who threatens their position. There was a case when Charles and others were out shooting, and they love killing animals, of course. When Charles was out shooting at Sandringham, a member of the public took a photograph of Charles shooting, and Charles was incensed and rang up the police and said, I want that man dealt with. And the police, to be fair to them, came along and said, well, he's on the public footpath. He can take a photograph if he wants to take a photograph. And the man was incensed, I think, went to the Mail on Sunday, I think it was. And the next thing happened was Charles's legal people phoned up them all, wrote to the Mail on Sunday and said, we want you to kill this story. And the Mail, to be fair to them, said, we're not doing it. That's how we know about this particular episode, because the Mail insisted on publishing it. So they will resort to lawyers if they can. So deference, secrecy, and legal threats they use to maintain their position and to prevent matters coming out. Now, where we are now is that a Pandora's box has been opened by Andrew, so we can be grateful to him for that, if not much else. And now people are beginning to ask questions, not just about Andrew, but of the wider royal family. One of the questions, of course, which is regularly popping up now at demonstrations, and they are becoming more frequent, is aimed at Charles. What did you know, and when did you know it? And why did you know nothing about it in relation to Andrew? But they're also asking questions about finance. There was a brilliant documentary on Channel 4, I think it was last year or the year before, which exposed the duchies and how Charles and William were charging millions to the NHS to park ambulances in an empty warehouse in London, charging the Royal Navy to moor ships next to their jetty, charging soldiers fighting for king and country to yomp across Dartmoor, charging the Ministry of Justice £1.5 million a year for an empty prison on Dartmoor because it happens to sit on Duchy land, charging the Scouts rent for their hut. I mean, you know, the list was endless. When the Northern Line extension was put in from Kennington to Battersea, they demanded money because a small section of the line went under Duchy land near Kennington. Nobody else along that stretch demanded money. Only the Duchy demanded money. They are greedy. They are greedy. They want to accumulate money. They have a sense of entitlement. They don't want to be found out about, and they want to carry on as they always have. And I say to them, this is not good enough in a modern democracy. They have to change. And even monarchists now are saying, if you don't change, you may find a tree that doesn't bend will break.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm astounded. I didn't realize the many ways in which they've accumulated wealth, quite immorally, actually,
Yes,
unethically, since what was it, 70? You said
1760.
1760, yeah. From 1760, they've been accumulating that wealth in all those ways. It's shocking. Well, I did try and get your book before this meeting, and I think, as you said, it's sold out. But I'm definitely going to get your book and read all these revelations. They're shocking, absolutely shocking. Thank you so much. And we have hands shooting up near Norman, people who want to ask you questions. So I've got Mike and Phil at the moment. So Mike, I'm going to bring Mike Hope in.
Yeah, thanks, Norman. Revelations galore. I mean, quite a few of them I was unaware of. Just to say, by the way, I was actually a constituent of yours in Lewes. I didn't vote for you. I don't mean to be rude. I arrived later in 2001 and I left after about 3 years and moved to Hastings. But you are looking better now than you did then, which perhaps says quite a lot. The question I wanted to ask is really, you're bringing out the dirty laundry big time. You are a Privy Councillor. Are there not sanctions against you? Are you not threatened with being guillotined or banged in the tower or God knows what else because of this? I can't see that you have the right of free speech, though you've been exercising it.
Well, I do have the right to free speech, as everybody in this country does, and everybody should exercise it. And I'm not going to be shut up. Look, yes, I am a Privy Councillor. It's a kind of nominal position, to be perfectly honest with you. Though I was at the Accession Council when Charles became king, and the monarchists looking down their nose at me and saying, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, someone had to believe in democracy in this place." So I was there for that to see what was happening. No, I mean, I think if they tried to chuck me out, it would be fantastic. I hope they do so. I'd welcome that because it'd be an opportunity to raise matters further, but sadly they haven't done so far. I haven't accepted a knighthood. I wouldn't accept a knighthood, not least of all because the sword might slip, mightn't it?
Does that mean then, sorry, this is just subsidiary question, that people can be chucked out, defrocked from the Privy Council? I wasn't aware of that.
Well, I don't know if they can or not. I think it'll have to be done through Parliament, and it's a complicated process. I don't think it gets to be done by a flick of the pen, but I don't really know, to be honest with you. But I don't think anyone has been chucked out. If there have been, then it would have been people who have been found guilty of serious offences, and therefore, perhaps were removed from the House of Lords at the same time. I don't know the answer to that one, but it doesn't leave me awake at night.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm bringing Phil Vellender now. Phil?
Hi there, Norman. Absolutely wonderful to listen to this detailed discussion. And I'm glad you mentioned the Channel 4 program in 2024, I think November. That is still a seminal document which everyone should watch, down to the fact the windows in the Duchy of Lancaster tenancy houses are still single pane and leak all the time in the winter, and he won't do anything to repair them. But I don't want to get lost in those details. I would like to ask you at some point if you could expand a little bit on the Privy Council question, because a lot of people don't know it exists. And when I rang into LBC once, I talked to one David Lammy, you may remember him. When I raised the question of Privy Council, because I think the Republic lot had been arrested on the day of the coronation, 13 of them bundled off under some specious excuse. And he said, "Oh well, the Privy Council doesn't do anything. There's no point. I mean, I've been along there, but it's not secret. It's just we just and they're not allowed to sit down on something, all that rubbish." And I thought, well, if it's such a pointless thing, why isn't it abolished? I mean, that's my view. And we've lived through rationalizations in our universities where a department is still selling steam trains. It's quite a point that it'd probably be closed down. So that's one thing I was going to point. But what fascinates me, Norman, is the overlap between where we are discussing the Crown, the system, the whole 1688 settlement that set up this thing that you rightly point out in 1760 delivered the monarchy this, and the overlap of the monarchy with the Crown. Because a lot of monarchists, a lot of anti-monarchists rather, say, well, you know, we just want to get rid of the crown. We'll have a presidential republic, all that sort of thing. But we would argue there's a big problem here, because the actual question is where sovereignty lies, and the crown has the sovereignty in Parliament, and we're arguing that sovereignty has to reside with the people, which is notionally what you were pointing out with the way these other monarchs have to show allegiance to their parliaments. So I suppose what I'm hoping to find out is a little bit more, how much would changing the financial situation of the monarch really change our democracy? Because it seems to us that the democracy itself is what the problem is. The state, it's called, but I think Crown is much better because it brings it closer to the function of what Starmer and co get up to. And you pointed out quite right that these tentacles stretch into all sorts of places. I mean, they go into the civil service, they go into heads of the armed forces, heads of the police, heads of the fire brigade, heads of all these things. And then there's the honours system, which is, of course, the buy them off method, isn't it? You know, if you've got, I watched this marvelous documentary on the Beatles. I see you're wearing a shirt representing this fine band. And the Beatles were argued to be leading a dangerous collapse in young people's morals. So let's buy them off with an MBE. So they did. And George said, well, we had a few joints in the toilet in Buckingham Palace, and that was their response. And of course, some of them, I think they sent them back. But anyway, that's the overlap I'm thinking of, Norman, really, between what you think the discussion about the crown, the monarchy could be, and how it overlaps with what we've been focusing on. Thank you.
Well, that's a huge number of questions there. I should just say that in my previous book, which is this one called "And What Do You Do?" What the Royal Family Don't Want to Know. There's a whole section on honours and the system and how that operates in there, which, as you say, is buying people off. And yes, John Lennon did return his MBE on the basis that Cold Turkey, the single, only got to number 13 in the charts, which is an interesting reason to return an MBE, I suppose. Look, I mean, the Privy Council, first of all. The Privy Council is secret, and the word privy means secret, and that's what it does. It doesn't do much, but it does some things. And for example, it deals with matters to do with universities, for example, as you may know, and it also deals with overseas territories where there are matters that have to come still, where there's still jurisdiction in the UK. They come before the Privy Council. Most of it is pretty harmless. The monarch just simply says, agree or refer. That's only two words which he or she utters. So it is pointless in that sense. But there are occasionally matters which, and there was one, I think, to do with Iraq, which came before Privy Council when I was there and inducted into it, which I really thought should have been in Parliament. So occasionally things get smuggled in there by the government of the day, which really ought to go before the House of Commons. So this isn't a problem with the royals per se. This is a problem with the government of the day, hiding behind royal skirts, which they do quite often. And they do, for example, with the ability to ask the King or the Queen to refuse permission for a bill to be introduced in Parliament, King's consent. And that's been used to prevent private members' bills being discussed on the floor of the Commons. So, King's consent and Prince's consent is an absolute constitutional nonsense, by the way. There's only one monarch, and it's not the Prince of Wales. They should be abolished, and they could be abolished, I'm advised, in 5 minutes on the floor of the Commons, if the government of the day decides to do so. So there is an unhealthy overlap between the royal family, if you like, in person, and the crown function, which seems to suit the government of the day and suits the royal family because it will smudge things around to get the result they want. If you take the Royal Collection, for example, which is an enormous amount of collection of artworks and so much no one ever sees, about 2% of it is available to the public. That comprises material which is both held for the state and personally held for the monarch. But there's no clear publication as to what's what. Now, this publication exists. This list exists, not the publication, the list exists. Because when I asked Gordon Brown in 2002, when he was Chancellor, he confirmed that they were separate lists. But they won't publish it. They won't even tell you what's there. So this Royal Collection held for us, we're not even allowed to know what's in it, let alone see it. So there's that kind of smudging between the two, which is deeply unhelpful and unhealthy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Norman. And thank you, Phil, for those questions. I've got three hands up now. So, Norman, I'll bring these three people in. And then if you can answer, if you can, just remember what the questions are, I'll bring them one after the other, and then we'll go back to you to give answers. So the
Okay.
first, if that's okay with you, the first one is John Spedding.
Yes, Erskine May. Erskine May was early 19th century.
1844.
Yeah. Is it editable? Can we change it?
Yes, it is.
So why should?
Sorry, I'm
why
going to do
should-
one question at a time here, Carol. It's like case law. As things change, it can be amended to reflect what new circumstances are, but the royal bit hasn't been amended.
Okay, sorry. I mean, we were gonna come back to Norman after the other people had asked their questions. So I'm going to go to Malcolm and then John. Malcolm.
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the first few minutes of your talk, so maybe you already dealt with this. But what I'd be interested to know is offshore banks or offshore banking, which seems to be mainly in British territories, which I presume belong to the Crown. Now, I don't know much about offshore banking, except it's normally thought to be dodgy in one way or another. And I wondered if you can say or know anything about the royal family's links to offshore banking and these various, I think they're part of the British Empire still, most of the Cayman Islands and places like that. That was my question. Thank you very much.
Very good question, Malcolm. I'll bring John in and then I go back to you, Norman, to take all of those questions. So, John Tumman.
Thanks, Carol. My question is very similar to Malcolm's. I noted that Norman mentioned that British overseas territories were one of the things that was the responsibility of the Privy Council. And of course, British overseas territories and crown dependencies are the very places where secret jurisdictions and tax havens are established. A very good book on this, which I read about 8 years ago now, which outlines the whole thing. So clearly there is lots of links between the way in which the money from major corporations, both British and international, is ferreted away in these places. And whenever people start talking about taxing the billionaires, I always think, how the hell did...
So I think I'm going to go back to Norman now to answer those questions, which were Erskine, can it be debunked? Can it be broken? And then also about overseas territories and overseas banks from Malcolm, and very similar from John. So I'm going back to you now, Norman, to answer those questions.
Well, I think I dealt with the Erskine May point, except to say that I mentioned sort of case law as equivalent. If the Speaker on the floor of the Commons says something and makes a ruling, he will make a ruling with an eye to Erskine May, but he could actually take things further. For example, I think the Speaker at the moment, who is reasonably progressive on these matters, will allow questions to be asked about royal finances and will allow questions to be asked about the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster. Now, he won't allow people to slag off individual members of the royal family per se, but I think by implication, if you attack the Duchy of Cornwall, you are referring to William or Charles. I think you will probably allow that. So, case law in the Commons, as it were, will evolve, even if Erskine May's language doesn't change. And I think it's possible to allow those sorts of questions to be asked, which previously would have been ruled out, could be now ruled in without the wording on Erskine May necessarily changing. In terms of offshore banking, I'm not an expert on this. I know they also have significant investments overseas. I know they also took steps to try and prevent their individual investments being identified and got a special exemption from an Act of Parliament in about 1970 something to prevent their personal interest being identified. As I say, what we know about them is what's in the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers, and if you're really interested, it's probably worth looking into those matters through those elements. But obviously, the point of using overseas territories is to avoid paying tax, as well as to secure secrecy. So they are tax avoidance places. That's what they're there for. They are tax havens. There's a whole wider issue, which goes way beyond the royal family, about tax havens and whether or not the British government, should do far more to rein in these places. We're busy telling everybody that we're clamping down on money laundering, but we don't seem to be dealing with those particular British overseas territories. But that's a wider point than simply the royal one.
Thank you very much indeed. John has actually said in the chat, I think we should call for the Crown to hold all their assets in the UK and pay tax on them. It's iniquitous that they are moving their assets to jurisdictions where we cannot access them. And I think he's absolutely right about that.
Well, I think so do I. And I think also in terms of the assets, if you look at what's happening with MPs, they are required, as Nigel Farage is finding out, to say what you've been given and to say what assets you have, and you're required to list your properties and so on. There's a proper register, and so it should be that way. There's no such requirement for the royal family, and if there were a requirement for the royal family, that would go a very long way to improving matters, which is why the updating of Freedom of Information Act and the inter-royal secrecy is terribly important and really a precursor to all sorts of reforms which we need to see.
Thank you very much, Norman. I've got Steve Freeman to come in now. Steve.
These are just, shall we say, odd questions, just random questions. The first thing was that obviously we're looking at a historical process with big turning points. You go 1066, 1649, and obviously for the modern monarchy, 1688 to, I'd say, 1707 when the UK was formed. So I was interested to know a little bit more. So we've got this new constitutional monarchy. We don't have the right to vote or anything at that point. What's going on in 1760? So it seems, I just bet the story, I don't know. What's happening in 1760 must be some big war or something happening that's caused them to be bankrupt. And that's, from what you're saying, that's a key date in the story that you've been telling us. I'd like to know a little bit more about that. Just as a comment, I can't believe they only got 1.8 billion. That seems like peanuts. I mean, everybody's got 1.8 billion these days. I mean, that's got to be an underestimate. I mean, they must have got shares in SpaceX and I don't know, everything all over. I mean, the point of the secrecy is we have no idea where their money is, not just in land, it's got to be in shares, and it must have been accumulated over a century or two of capitalism. It just be, I think if the secrecy is so important, because if we knew how wealthy they were, we would still be really scandalized by that. I don't think anybody's scandalized by a mere 1.8 billion these days. That's just peanuts. The other thing I think was, I do think the Privy Council is more important in the story than we probably understand, for reasons not only orders in council, but I've often thought that we've got three parliaments in this country. We've got the House of Lords, we've got the House of Commons, and then we've got this one, which is that the King's Parliament is how I would say it, where it's very, very important in the whole system, especially in foreign affairs. I think you've said that. Orders in council, going to war, many things that are done. And I know it can just be done on a nod because they probably worked it out before they arrived to nod it through. It's already been discussed behind the scenes between Downing Street and the palace, as it were. So when they turn up, it's just rubber stamp, rubber stamp, rubber stamp. But I do think people don't know much about this. I don't know much. Maybe people don't. And I feel it's a much bigger part of the story of modernizing this country than we realize. I think that's my last comment, I suppose, is that the monarchy is really above the law at the end of the day, because they are head of the law. They're head of they're head of the legal system as well. I don't think the king can be prosecuted. I'm not sure in his own courts, probably not. So I think being above the law is something we sometimes speak about, people being above the law, but we have got these people who really are above the law anyway. Okay,
well, good. A number of good points. So let me just try and respond to them. 1760, before 1760, the monarch had to pay for every aspect of the state. The army, the navy, the customs and excise, the civil service, all those sorts of things were paid for personally by the king. And he had royal lands, which gave him an income. But the royal lands did not provide enough income to cover the increasing costs. And therefore, when George III came to the throne in 1760, the new arrangement was that Parliament would take over the cost of running the state, and in return, the Crown lands would be given to Parliament for Parliament to use and get profit from. And the king would also, in addition, he had already had this, have a small, it was quite small really, civil list to help him undertake functions. So that was a big change in 1760. And of course, relieved of the need to fund and look after the organs of state, that meant that it was largely a one-way system of money coming into the monarch and nothing very much going out, which is why, because the civil list was set incorrectly and generously, that enabled the king to accumulate money. That's one of the ways in which the monarchy became richer. On the 1.8 billion, that's the estimate for Charles alone. You have to add in separate estimates for the other members of the royal family. So the royal family as a whole, even by the official estimates, is probably worth 10 billion. I don't know. No one's done that estimate, not even me. But the 1.8 is Charles. But I agree with you that that's an underestimate because it fails to take into account the very likely fact that there's going to be overseas investments we don't know about. It doesn't take into account, for example, the Transylvanian cottages, which he owns in Transylvania, very close to Count Dracula's castle. All those bits and pieces around the place aren't included in the estimates which are made. So I think 1.8 billion is an underestimate for Charles. I don't know what it is, the real figure, but you have to add on the individual wealth of other members of the royal family to get an overall figure for the royal family, which is way in excess of 1.8 billion. By the way, just in terms of secrecy as well, we have since 1911 not been able to see royal wills. There was an application in the court in 1911 to freeze a will, to keep it secret, because there was an embarrassment involving a mistress at the time. And that was the reason that was done. But it's very convenient for the royal family not to be able to publish their wills. It's now a matter of course that they're not published, because what that means is that we don't know how much money they're passing on. And that's the main reason, I think, why the royals are very keen to keep their wills secret. The opening up of wills, which was the first Freedom of Information Act, if you like, in this country, going back centuries, was there to prevent corruption occurring. And the fact that the royal wills are now sealed potentially allows corruption to take place. Interestingly, of course, Andrew will not be covered by that particular condition. He's no longer a member of the royal family. So Andrew's will in due course will be published, as Diana's was when she died. I wouldn't call the Privy Council the King's Parliament because the monarch only comes along and says refer or agree. Now, there may have been discussions beforehand with the palace in the way that the monarch is allowed to advise and counsel, which is the traditional rule the monarch has. But the Privy Council, in my view, is not particularly there to serve the royals. It's there to provide the government with a means of doing things which are kept from the public and are kept from the Commons. And that's its function. I don't think I said it, but it's the government of the day hiding behind royal skirts to do things which they would find difficult to justify in Parliament. In some cases, a lot of it's completely innocuous, but the odd thing does go through that really should be in the Commons.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to Mike Hope now again.
Yeah, just a brief question. Thinking about empire, there is the question of which we haven't mentioned the S word yet, slavery, and the question of reparations. I do note that when this has been raised with the royals or questions pointed at the royals, everybody's got awfully defensive, and barriers started shooting up all over the place. I mean, clearly the royals were able to consolidate their wealth enormously through slavery, because they are, the crown. They are part of the crown, which is part of the development of the City of London and all the institutions of British capitalism that we know. So, I mean, is there any estimate, Norman, as to, what proportion of what is now their accumulated wealth does actually come from slavery? And is there any means of being able to hold them more sort of closely to account, other than these foot shuffling exercises that we've seen so far?
I think I think the question of reparations is one where the Royals would have to have a common position with the government today, because we couldn't have one element, either the government or the monarchy, saying they're going to pay reparations without the other one also doing the same thing. It would look very disorganized, a bit disorientated and disconnected. So I think there had to be a government agreement to that. I'm not aware that anyone actually wants to pay reparations, either in the government or the royal family. So in that sense, they're in a happy position where they agree with each other. It's not simply slavery, by the way, it's also empire generally, because if you look at the wealth, for example, in jewellery, which the royal family's accumulated, £500 million was the latest estimate of what they've got, which is worth in their vaults. Some of that, of course, was simply stolen from places like Pakistan and India at the time. That's why I'm having it. And very keen servants of the empire would find these things and send them back to Queen Victoria or whoever it would happen to be and say, here's a present for you from the empire. Whether or not the locals had any say in the matter, I think is highly doubtful. So there ought to be, I think this is probably easier politically with a small p to deal with than slavery. We ought to be returning some of these jewels to where they came from. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, for example, fantastic diamond, should be returned from where it came. And some of those things could be done and should be done.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thanks very much, Mike, for that question as well. So at the moment, I don't see any further hands up to ask questions. So I would like to just go back to you, Norman, for your concluding remarks.
Just to say, it's always a joy to talk about these matters. People are always horrified by the full extent of the greed and the lack of accountability and the brazenness of the royals. And I'm happy to say that those who read my books, even if they're monarchies, turn out to sometimes amend their views, having found out the facts. So I would encourage your colleagues to get hold of the book, which has been out since, I'm not quite sure the camera works, been out since November, and selling quite well. I'm just about, this month, I'm updating it for the paperback edition, which will be out in about September. And the previous book, which is even more salacious and disreputable in terms of its respect towards the royal family, is this one. And what do? You have to say it in the Queen's voice, because that's what she asks you or asked you.
Yeah.
Because I think it's time for people to ask them what they did, and what the royal family don't want you to know. So those two books, I think, give you all you need to know. But warning to you is take a chapter at a time and make sure you've got some blood pressure tablets handy.
Right, absolutely. Oh, I've got one more hand up. Are you willing to take another question,
Okay.
Norman? Malcolm?
Yeah, it wasn't a question. I mean, when I was a Republican before you were born, and I came from a royalist family, and I can remember sitting at a very large meal once with everybody round there, and they were all saying how wonderful the royals were, and how hard they worked, and how extraordinary they all were. And this voice from about a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old came from the bottom of the table saying, "But what do they actually do?" And everybody looked askance and said, "Well, they work very hard."
Yes. Yes. Well, there you are. I think a 12-year-old has perhaps got a lot of sense, and asked a pertinent question. Same question to my book.
I have got your book, actually.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. I think that's a really good point to end on the story. Oh, Phil's got another question. Sorry, Norman. I think that's a really good. I thought that was a good way to end it. What do they do? Almost nothing.
No, I haven't got an answer for that. No, Norman. A very quick question. Do you remember back in the 1990s? I think it was. There was a series on the Windsors, which was about six programs, I don't know if you remember this, but it's quite extraordinary. It had quite a lot of details. I mean, what I remember is that 70% of the population admitted they dream of the Queen every night. I thought it was really quite
A nightmare.
well, I can't possibly say, but I just wonder, because this is an amazing series which followed that book by Andrew Morton, if you remember, who wrote Diana, yes, and he was greatly involved with this series, and it's disappeared. You can't seem to get hold of it. But if you should ever find it, do indeed let us know, because it contains a lot of information which sort of disappeared, and a lot of very fine interviews with people like Norman St. John Stevens.
Was it BBC or was it ITV or what was it?
I believe it's ITV or Channel 4.
Right. Well, I mean, I know Andrew Morton, so I'll ask him when I see him.
Would you? Oh, that'd be fantastic, because I'd love to get hold of it. It's got, as I say, it's a mine of information.
Well, one last thought to encourage you all, I hope, so it encourages me, is that the British, what's it called? British Attitude Survey, I think it's called, which has been running since 1983. In 1983, 88% of people thought it was very important or quite important to have a monarchy. That figure's now 51%, which is a huge drop over that period of time. And for those under 44, a majority are now in favour of something else. So, you know, the time is running out for the royals. They're relying on people my age and beyond, not me, obviously, to keep them where they are. But, you know, when the older generation dies off, there'll be a majority in favour of a republic. They haven't got very long to sort themselves out.
Good. Very encouraging words, Norman. Thank you so much. It's been, the amount of information you've given us is mind-blowing. And so we need to go out and get your 2 books now. Thank you so much for talking to us. I've learned so much, and I knew that the royal family were not very nice people. Now I have all the evidence to back that up. Thank you very much, Norman. Thank you to everybody who's come to the meeting and asked questions.